In this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about critically analyzing research articles. This is one of the competencies that you're going to develop in this course, and it's extremely important whether or not you choose to pursue a career in research or in practice. In this course, I want you to focus on selecting articles from peer-reviewed journals. This ensures that a manuscript went through a rigorous review process prior to publication, and it's usually considered like the gold standard of publication. Um, Even with the peer review process in place, which helps to ensure that we're publishing quality articles, there are inherently limitations with any published article, regardless of whether it went through that peer review process. And one of the things that I often find is that when my students in other courses are asked to do an article summary or an article review or an article critique, they wind up simply restating what can already be found in the article. And so you need to be thinking beyond what the author stated and consider what the limitations and the strengths are of each article. This is going to be exceptionally important as a skill for you to develop as a behavior analyst because all of your clients have the right to effective behavioral interventions. But I know that mastering this skill is something that takes time and it takes process, and it's a frustrating practice or process. So I want to go over some different ways that you can learn to be more critical of the literature. There are several different ways that you can learn this skill and approach critically analyzing different studies. One of the ways that you're probably familiar with is using a standardized tool like the scientific merit rating system. Most of you have used the SMRS in your introduction class. Remember, this is a systematic way of evaluating the quality of articles. It was developed for the National Standards Project. And basically, when you're reading the article, you can assign a numerical score to a number of different variables. You get a total score, and depending upon where the total score is, it gives you an indication of the quality of an article. There are certainly benefits to using a standardized protocol such as the SMRS, but there are also limitations. And I would be lying to you if I told you that I broke out the SMRS every time I read an article. It just doesn't happen. It's a time consuming process. There's specific training that really should go into using the SMRS. And so I want to tell you or walk through kind of how I go through articles. So when I was in graduate school, I learned to be critical of articles by reviewing what we all uh, colloquially term the 10 questions. And so we had this research class where each week someone presented an article and we had 10 questions to answer regarding the quality of the article. And our professors would randomly call on us each week to answer one of these 10 questions. And you never knew if you were going to get called on or what question you were going to get. And at the time, it was really anxiety provoking to me. But throughout the years, I've gotten more comfortable with this, and I hope that you get more comfortable with this process through completing your article critique. In your article critique, you're going to go through these 10 questions. I've actually expanded upon them over the years, and so I have more questions in my head as I weigh out. Different articles, the strengths and limitations of each article, and I'll talk you through some of them. I'm going to talk about them in the order that they're assigned for your article critique, but in my head, when I'm reading articles, sometimes I go about this in a different order. I just wanted to make sure that I was matching it to the course content that we were talking about as closely as possible. So, the first thing that I always do is I try to read the article through and I try to think about what is the purpose of this article? What were the researchers evaluating? And I look at the research questions and I try to determine whether or not the research questions are clearly stated. Believe it or not, sometimes the research questions are unclear and I don't really understand them in certain articles, and that makes it really hard to determine whether or not the methods are appropriate and the results and conclusions that the authors made are appropriate. So ask yourself, are these research questions clearly defined? Can I make sense of them? Can I use these research questions to make determinations about the rest of the article and the quality of the rest of the article? And if not, how should they be revised? The other thing that I tend to look at is the literature review and whether or not the authors developed a literature review that provides a compelling rationale for the need for the study. Sometimes researchers do this, and sometimes the rationale, while I understand the research questions and the purpose, the rationale or how the authors got to that point is unclear. The thing to keep in mind about the literature review is they're kind of subject to bias. So, as an author, I can really find literature to support my research questions, regardless of what it is. And so, I like to evaluate whether or not the authors not only provided a compelling rationale, but whether or not they weighed the breadth of literature, including literature that might be in support or in favor of their research questions and methodology, and those which might serve as a sort of roadblock. So that's going to be part one of your article critique. The next thing that I look at is the dependent variables and the independent variables. So I want to know, what are the dependent variables? So remember, the dependent variables are going to be your outcome measure. These are your data, and how you're measuring intervention effectiveness. So what are the dependent variables? Are they clearly defined? And are they appropriate given the research questions and the clients? So, for example, someone recently presented some data to me and they were trying to develop an intervention to decrease elopement. And they used a 10-second partial interval recording scheme where they measured elopement. They defined it as being the individual walking outside of the plane of the door. But there are some problems with that measurement system, and that um, it might not reflect all instances of elopement. So another way would be to measure that variable might be to just click whether or not they eloped. And with elopement, that's a potentially dangerous behavior, and so you want to make sure that you're catching every instance and that you are responding appropriately. So, what are the dependent variables? Are they clearly defined? And do they make sense given the target behavior? What are the independent variables? Are these clearly defined? And as you're reading through the independent variables, this is, remember, the intervention or what's being manipulated. I want to know, is there enough information provided here that I can replicate this? Because that's a really important external validity question. If I can't replicate it, what other information is needed in order to do so? The next thing that I look at is the research design and whether or not the research design has appropriate controls for internal validity, and whether or not it was appropriate given the research questions. I also like to think in my head about other research questions that could have been used. This is important when you're evaluating your results. The next thing that I want to look at is whether or not there are adequate controls for internal validity and external validity. And as you'll learn later in the semester, some designs are better at controlling for specific threats to internal validity. I always want to look at the external validity of a study. What is the extent to which this study and the results of this study is likely to generalize to other participants? Look at whether the participants were clearly described. So, for example, if an intervention was developed and all of the participants had average or above average IQ, then I might not want to use this intervention with someone who has a cognitive delay. And so you want to make sure that the authors are providing enough information regarding the participants. I look to see whether or not they're providing information about reliability, so inter-observer agreement, treatment fidelity, and or procedural fidelity. Are those data reported? Are they strong? And you'll read a couple of chapters in your measurement section about internal and external validity. So I think it's good to be very familiar with those concepts before you begin critically analyzing or evaluating different articles. The next thing that you want to look for are what are the results. And I try to summarize the results without looking at what the author said. So I look at the graph and I try to determine whether or not I feel that there's a meaningful change given level, trend, and variability. You'll learn more about visual analysis later in the semester, but I look at whether or not the results or the conclusions were justified based on the results. So sometimes authors might uh, report implications that go a little bit above and beyond what's supported by their results. And so you want to look at that. Um, if you don't feel that the conclusions are justified by the results, think about what else you would need in order to feel confident in the results and whether or not what you would need in order to use uh, the results obtained or the intervention that was evaluated. The other thing that I look at is the limitations, and I read over the author's stated limitations, but I also, as I'm reading an article, I keep a list just on a piece of notebook paper about the limitations that I observe. And I try to check to see whether or not the authors adequately discussed all of those limitations. The limitations are going to determine or help me determine whether or not I'm likely to use this intervention or dismiss it. The other thing that I like to look at is the stated implications. And I try, similar to limitations, I try to come up with my own list of implications. And then I weigh the implications and the limitations when I'm determining whether or not I'm going to use an intervention. For purposes of your article critique, I also want you to start thinking about research questions that you can uh, that come, that could be used to conduct a follow-up study. So now that you've read this article and you understand the strengths and the limitations, what are the next steps? What are the next steps, excuse me? What research is needed moving forward? And that's really important because we always want to be driving the practice of ABA forward and making sure that it's cutting edge and that we're staying with best practice and developing interventions that are likely to be effective. That is all that I have talking a little bit about critically analyzing different articles. Be sure to touch base with your instructor if you have any questions or concerns. All of the instructors are here to support you in mastering this very important competency. Thank you.